Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for joining us today in our webinar, Embodied Carbon, State of Supply Chain, Transparency, and Tools to Streamline Embodied Carbon Considerations. I'm Daisy from Clean Air Partnership, and today with us, our guest speaker is Nicole Granat, co-founder of Tangible, and she'll introduce herself shortly. But first, I wanted to start with land acknowledgement. Clean Air Partnership is a Toronto-based organization, and we acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We wanted to remind you that we have two Clean Air Council tools. The Climate Policy Database tracks climate-related policies. Now it's very easy to see and access those policies among the CSC network. And the Climate Action Atlas tracks implemented ambitious mitigation projects. It goes even beyond CSC because we wanted to showcase some leading practices from other municipalities. I will share a link shortly in the chat so you can access them. Also a reminder for our upcoming events, if you want to stay on the top of what is coming up, please sign to our newsletter. I will share a link shortly as well. That's where you can see what's coming up and also get the links to register if you want to access some of the upcoming webinars. On November 15th, we are going to talk with Quest. They completed a Net Zero Communities Accelerated Pilot Program, so we'll learn a little bit more about that program and the cohort that they did in the prairies with municipalities in the prairies area. On November 22nd, we are going to present our newly Climate Accountability Toolkit as part of the Climate Governance Accountability and Implementation CSC series. And I'll shortly share a link to this event as well. But now, without further ado, I would like to pass it to Nicole.
Thanks, Desi. Lovely to meet everyone here. And do you mind if I take over screen sharing?
Yes, go ahead. I just wanted to say while you're changing the screen that you can use the chat box for everyone to ask your questions. And also after the presentation, we'll have time if you want to ask your question verbally. It's kind of like a discussion that we want to have here. And take it away, Nicole.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Desi, and thanks, Gabby. Really appreciate the Clean Air Partnership having me and being introduced to this community. So lovely to virtually meet all of you. My name is Nicole Granith, and I'm one of the co-founders of Tangible Materials. Excited to share, of course, what we're up to, but really first a little bit more of a deep dive on embodied carbon. And my background in the space is that I most recently was leading sustainability for a flooring manufacturer, was working with the tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers to figure out how we could decarbonize the supply chain emissions for the flooring, the process emissions, the ultimate install and end of life emissions, and then to communicate that out to the global markets in which we sold. And it was through that effort that I was seeing a lot of incredible folks work on embodied carbon and was realizing that it would be very helpful to have a software solution to enable that work at scale and to speed up what is possible. So that's the winding path by which I came to found Tangible just under 2 years ago, and excited to share more about any of this. So if there are any questions, feel free to pause me at any time and hop on and just jump in and ask, or to drop them in the chat and we can get to them after. Lovely. So I always like to start by grounding ourselves in what our mission is. And we are unabashed climate nerds. And so our straightforward mission is to turn buildings from a cause of the climate crisis into a solution. That is entirely possible And we've already made great headway on the operational side of that, of how do we reduce the emissions from operating buildings. But now we are increasingly needing to deal with the emissions from the actual materials used to build those buildings, whether that's ground up new construction, major retrofits, or ongoing refurbishments. All of those materials have emissions that are in aggregate 11% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And as an industry, as a society, we have found it really difficult over the last 20, 30 years to address this at scale. There have been a lot of folks who've been, beating the drums around this and sharing the ways in which we need to be driving embodied carbon or the emissions from building materials down. And thankfully, we are now at a point where people are realizing that the embodied carbon of a building, or the carbon that is emitted to extract the materials, to transport them to the manufacturing facility, and to ultimately manufacture them, that can be equivalent to 10 years of operating a building. And so there has now been this increased attention on what to do about embodied carbon. And there's also obviously a massive portion of this that is the concrete, the steel, the structural materials. But something else that we want to make sure to highlight is that it really is the full set of materials within a building that has this impact, because the concrete and the steel have a massive upfront impact, but then the envelope of a building also has a large ongoing or a large upfront impact. And then on an ongoing basis, there are updates that are typically made to interiors, and those as well will continue to have embodied carbon emissions that building is incurring. So this is an example from an architect that looked back at their own headquarters and looked at the overall impact of embodied carbon over the course of the time they'd been occupying their building. And they realized that actually, because of the retrofits and refurbishments, the interiors and the envelope ended up being equal to, if not greater than, the impact of the structure up front. So all of this is fair game, and there are many solutions out there that are worth exploring for structures, envelope, and interiors. And it really does start at the manufacturing of these products. So if you think about the various stages at which a building product can influence the carbon emissions that are going into the atmosphere, the majority of that is going to be in the upfront production of it. So that's what I was mentioning before, of the extraction of the raw materials to create that material, that building product, the transportation to the facility, the production at the facility. That's about 65 to 85% of the total impact. And then there is this long tail of the impact at the actual construction site. So what's the transportation to get to the job site? What's emitted when you're actually installing that product? So think like a product that needs to be laid using a machine that is powered by gas. All of those emissions are going to be captured in this construction side of the emissions. And then even as the building goes into use and maintenance, and ultimately if there's an end of life or demolition, deconstruction, reuse possibilities, each of those stages has its own associated impacts on a carbon basis that are associated with those materials. So really, this is a full life cycle issue that we're looking at. The reason that a lot of focus right now is on upfront embodied carbon is because that's where a lot of the big impact can be made if people have access to that information in a scalable, interpretable way, so they can understand how they can start to choose lower carbon materials. And a lot of the reason that people are paying attention to this is because in recent years, as people in the real estate industry have been starting to analyze not just their scope 1 and 2 emissions around operating buildings, but also their broader scope 3 emissions, and starting to see those emissions over which they may not have direct control, but are ultimately in some way, shape, or form responsible for, they're realizing that building materials are a massive portion of that impact that they're having. And so within their total emissions, we looked at a few publicly published reports and saw that it was anywhere from 58 to 83% of scope or of total emissions were just building materials for these developers. And of course, for some folks who only do development and don't actually hold or operate their own buildings, that can be closer to the high 90s. For those who do a mix of development and management or operations, that can be where it's closer to that, maybe 50%. But one way or another, it is a massive responsibility. And we, as an industry, are now working to figure out, okay, how do we actually approach taking responsibility for those emissions and for driving them down at the source? And that's where a lot of the investor pressure, a lot of the pressure coming from the broader lending landscape, the insurance side of the world, and generally tenants and clients who are asking for these types of disclosures and this type of action. So we've seen it, whether it is the BMO climate ambitions that they were in which they talk about how exactly they want to reach net zero, or it's developers like Hines talking about embodied carbon specifically, the tenants such as Salesforce putting out claims that they are going to drive their embodied carbon down by 80% by 2030, or LPs like the California Public Employees Retirement System or the Canada Public Pension Plan talking about reaching net zero, and all of that needing to trickle into the operations of the real estate companies that have exposure to it. So that's the investor and market side of the world that's really spurring a lot of this action. But the good news is there are pathways to reduction. And so many of you might be familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This group is really working to find actionable paths by which we can reach a 1.5 degree Celsius of warming future, where we don't actually exceed 1.5 degrees and go beyond to 2 and above, and is charting a path and saying, okay, any organization that wants to actually seriously commit to what they're going to need to do in order to have a science-based target around that. These are the guidelines that they as an industry have, or they as a consortium have put out. And they have just released their draft guidelines for buildings a few months back. And under these draft guidelines, they've split out different typologies, and they've also instituted a stepped approach. So every 5 years, the goal is that the embodied carbon intensity of the construction that is going to be happening, whether in this case, I've included the one that is corrected for renovation. So this would include both ground up new construction as well as any renovation activity that happens. And that the goal here is essentially, if you measure the total carbon emissions of the building materials to create that building, the total embodied carbon of building that building, and then you divide that by the square meters of the building itself, you get what's called an embodied carbon intensity. In this case, they're calling it upfront embodied greenhouse gas emission intensity, but it is the same if you're familiar with an energy use intensity, the same concept of being able to figure out per square meter what is the amount of emissions that was attributable to the building materials in this building. And they have pretty stringent targets, as you can see, stepping down, where as we go, for example, on the residential side from 406 in 2025, what they're saying is that we need to get to 11.3 kilos of CO2 equivalent per meter squared by 2050. So that's going to be a massive change in how exactly we are going to be building buildings. And that, if we're looking again at, if we're honing in on the residential side of the world for new homes, this is a report that RMI put out. They've been doing great work around embodied carbon, well, operational carbon for many years, and have turned a strong focus to embodied carbon recently. And the goals that they're putting out are saying, okay, the current average is sitting here about 200 kilos of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. So if you noted on the last chart, we had 406 as that goal. So doing pretty well. But in order to drive these reductions that are implied by the SBTI goals or by what RMI is implying here of net zero by 2040, there are large design choices on a material basis that first need to be made, or large material swaps that need to be made, and then we need to start making design choices that are incredibly efficient with materials, that work on having materials that actually can sequester carbon and that incorporate reuse and the ability to repurpose various types of materials, or to be incredibly intelligent about how we're using the existing stock of materials or resources that we have rather than extracting new ones. So all of this, I say in the context of, it's a tall order for what we as an industry need to start driving toward, but there are better products out there. And so the current state, you can see the as-built materials category. This is the current state of basically the standard, what you would find for a concrete mix, for exterior cladding, for flooring. And then these are the options that are currently best available on the market, where you can have supplementary cementitious materials that are added to your concrete mix in order to make the cement lower, a lower percentage of the concrete, and therefore lower carbon. You can, instead of brick, use engineered wood. You can switch some of your interior cladding and flooring choices, and that's what's available right now. So of course, there are also availability constraints and price questions, and making sure that that we have a workforce that is trained in installing different types of materials. But these are very possible and deployable today. And then what this report imagines is, how do we drive toward the up to 140% reduction options that are the best possible? What does that look like to imagine in 10 years, residences built with using mycelium composite and clay for flooring, for using agricultural residue fibers in the cavity insulation, rather than the high carbon fiberglass that's used right now, and really pushing us to say, okay, how do we need to invest in order to start to make some of these possible? And you'll see this is driven, Chris Magwood has been at the forefront of the industry for many years, advocating for these types of different materials. And this also comes from that RMI report. And it also leads us to think about, okay, how do we at scale start to find and identify some of those products? Maybe they are scalable today. Maybe they're ones that we need to start deploying on pilot projects so we can get out into the world. But there are examples of various types of products that are already on the market that sequester carbon and don't just emit less carbon, but actually are able to sequester carbon and be deployed at scale today. So all of that, so far, we've talked about the broad problem, why there's been increased focus on embodied carbon, and where some of these pathways that we're going to need to comply with actually come into play. This is now against the backdrop of increasing legislation. So the legislative bodies here, you'll see a few different types of jurisdictions. We have municipalities, we have provinces and states, and then overlaid on top of this are also the federal policies in both Canada and the US. So we have an article that I am happy to share after as a resource, but just wanted to highlight this graphic that our founding researcher put together around the different types of policies that we're seeing in different jurisdictions, and whether it is something that is being implemented via a tax incentive as per New Jersey, whether there's a requirement for a whole building LCA as in Vancouver and Toronto, or if there are certain building permit and building intensity policies that are being put into place. And two key things to call out here are that one, in the Toronto jurisdiction, with the Toronto Green Standard, there is now a requirement, an embodied carbon cap for all new public buildings. And there is also a requirement for a whole building LCA. And then in California, there was about, let's see, at the end of August of this year, 2023, the Cal Green Building Code came out and said that by July 1 of next year, 2024, all buildings that are going to be going through the permitting process will need to comply with one of 3 embodied carbon reduction pathways. So just examples there of seeing it at the municipal level, seeing it at the state or provincial level, and then at the federal level, what we've seen is, with the in the states with the Inflation Reduction Act, we've seen that there have been stipulations around purchasing low carbon materials. In Canada, with the greening government strategy, you've seen the request for embodied carbon reductions on the concrete side specifically. And so there are different avenues by which people are starting to explore taking action around embodied carbon, ranging from material specific to first just measure, and then ultimately driving tord what we're seeing Toronto do with actual embodied carbon intensity caps. So happy to share more there, but we're keeping a very close eye on how this is all developing. And so just to zoom us out for a moment, if we think about where we are right now as an industry, we're really in this phase of measuring embodied carbon, of taking a look and saying, okay, this is where things stand. And that is fantastic because it's on the back of work that a lot of folks have been doing for the last 10 plus years of saying, hey, you need to focus on embodied carbon. And now people, as they are actually turning in that direction, are just saying, where are we? Where do our buildings stand? What are good benchmarks? What are the things that we should be baselining against? And then how do we start to project and determine what those paths forward should be? As we move forward, as we discussed in the conversation around the SBTI guidelines, around where the RMI report around single family homes and residences was implying, we're really going to have to shift to a set of decisions around materials that is focused on first reducing the embodied carbon of the materials that we are specifying, just to whatever we can find that is lower, and then ultimately to drive that toward materials that are sequestering carbon and are no longer going to be in aggregate having the massive impact that we are currently seeing today. And that's going to take time. That's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take a fair amount of enablement from the software side of the world, the consultant side of the world, to really help everyone understand where are these low-hanging fruit options and how do we drive toward the ambitious side of that. And as we get toward 2030, which is only a few short years away, we really need to be aiming for 40 to 48% reduction is what the implication of the SBTI draft guidelines is in those embodied carbon emissions. And if we're looking in this case at an office building typology, we need by 2050 to be at 10.3 kilos of CO2 equivalent per meter squared, not corrected for renovation. And so thinking about how to get from that 600 number for offices all the way down to that 10 kilos, it's going to be a systems level change that is required, going to be an all hands on deck effort. And so that's why what we need is to fundamentally change what gets built in this society. And the current state is people don't know how their portfolios stack up. They don't know what an individual building performance is, let alone what that looks like across all of the developments or buildings that are in their control. There are currently a limited set of tools to be able to drive forward the reporting itself. And consultants have a massive lift of just trying to aggregate all of that information and trying to figure out how to just get it into a format that is helpful for clients, let alone being able to focus on driving the strategy of how to reduce it. And then they have to go back and redo those reports if anything changes. And then it's been very difficult traditionally. We love a good PDF report and communicating via email, but when all of the collaboration is PDFs, emails, or emailed PDFs or spreadsheets, it makes it difficult to track what are the scalable solutions that come from one project that can be applied to another one. And then the tricky part is, again, because a lot of the attention has to be right now on just gathering this information and benchmarking and understanding that building asset level performance, and then hopefully getting toward portfolio performance, that then there isn't nearly as much time to spend on what are the actions that we need to be taking. And as you just saw from everything that we were talking about that pretty steep curve that we need to start driving down, that's where we need the resources to be directed. That's what we need people to be freed up to be focused on. So that's where the goal with what we're trying to enable at Tangible, or what we are enabling, is to understand not just an asset level embodied carbon performance, but also what does this look like across the entirety of the sets of buildings that people have control and agency over. What is the set of learnings that can be taken from one type of projects and can be applied to another type of project? And what are the changes that, as those are updated and the people who are really trying to drive action around this can take that information in real time and then spend the bulk of their time saying, hey, actually, now that we know where these assets stand, now that we know what the impact of the current sets of materials that we are specifying and can make those changes and have everything be updated accordingly, we can that much more easily spend the rest of our time, the bulk of our time, focusing on how do we make it possible to drive toward those low carbon materials, to drive toward the carbon sequestering materials, to drive toward the material efficient design choices that are going to need to be made. And then how, lastly, do we make sure that everyone who is responsible in the stakeholder chain has both the information that they need to understand what their responsibility is in this long chain of emissions that have been passed from stakeholder to stakeholder, and then that they not only understand and are read in or are informed about it, but they actually can see a very clear path toward the action that they, in their individual role, can help foster and enable. So that's what we have built at Tangible. And it has been incredible as we've been sitting down and speaking with a lot of the leaders in the space around embodied carbon to just understand and learn what are the things that you need in order to make you faster, in order to enable this systems level change that we all are driving toward. And what we were hearing is that they are looking for being able to measure that impact in real time and to have the lift be much lower than it currently is, And then that frees them up to start to say, okay, great, now we can take action immediately in a way that is relevant to the construction stage that we're at, to identify where the lowest hanging fruit is and what that looks like in the potential different materials that could be used, the potential design decisions that could be altered, and to have that measurement inform action, and then ultimately to be able to report on it in the ways that will get increased buy-in from, whether it's from clients or from tenants or from the regulatory and green standards bodies that are trying to move this action forward. All of that then creates a virtuous cycle of freeing people up to be able to spend more time on the strategic level decisions that need to be made to actually drive us toward our ambitious goals. And the way that we at Tangible have done this is that we've built a database of materials that is aggregated from a number of different sources. The focus is on the embodied carbon information of these materials and surfacing both the incumbent products, like the eco versions of existing products, as well as a number of these innovative products, because the solution is going to require both. And in addition to having the embodied carbon information, we also, where possible, have surfaced other material health information. So you can see the various certifications and documents that we want to make possible for people to sort by, so that if there are chemicals of concern that they want to filter out, or if there are questions around it being low VOC, low volatile organic compound, like low emitting materials, or if there are questions around it having recycled content or bio-based content, all of those are incredibly important multi-attribute sustainability requirements that are just as much a part of the conversation. And so that all is what enables us to measure embodied carbon, not just at one singular point during the construction process or after it's been completed, but to deeply embed in the construction process over time. This is crucial because, as you saw in those graphs of where we need to be driving action, there are many different possibilities for how to make embodied carbon reductions. At the earliest stages, when the project is in concept phase or schematic design, that's when there are a lot of decisions that can still be made around, should we use this type of structure or should we use this type of structure? We had one person tell us that because they themselves conduct whole building LCAs on every single building that they do, and at different points during the process, when they had a design in schematic design come over to them, and for some reason saw that it was dramatically higher carbon than their previous ones had been at that point, they dug into the designs and realized that there was a whole bunch of aluminum siding that was used as an aesthetic choice. And so they went back to their design partner and said, hey, we actually need to change this because that has a massive embodied carbon impact. And they were able to find a different material to, they reduced some of the wings that they were going to use, and then switched to a much lower carbon material rather than the aluminum. And that was all enabled because they did that early stage estimation. But the person who was telling me this was saying it took so much work to conduct that analysis, and that it's what she spends all of her time on, that they're only just now starting to be able to identify some of those hotspots. And it would be, of course, so much easier if it were possible to aggregate all of that information and have a software to automatically flag, hey, these are decisions that are out of the norm or much higher carbon than what you typically have been seeing or what is even possible. So that's one anecdote, an example of what's possible at the early stage. As we get into whether it's the design development side of things or move into construction documents. And so where the project is going to be more specifically designed, or as we're getting into construction documents, there are actual materials being selected. That's where the database that we've aggregated has information on product specific embodied carbon impacts, and where we have found people are very interested in saying, okay, I was thinking about using this product, but now I want to see how it stacks up against these 4 or 5 other ones so that I can get an understanding of which is the lowest carbon and how can I start to push that decision making into or incorporate those criteria into our decision making. So early stage, being able to, Tangible has an estimation feature that enables those kind of high level structural decisions. And then as you get into the more product specific side, really wanting to enable that with the database of various options. And then as the project continues and ultimately gets built, and there's an opportunity to do a full retrospective on where were the types of over embodied carbon decisions or overly high embodied carbon decisions that were made, what are the things that we can improve on next time, what was the additional waste that was on the site, what was the carbon impact of all of the final material decisions rather than just what was thought was going to be specified. That's where there's true opportunity to say, okay, now that we have this information in front of us, we can start in a much better informed place for the next project. And all of that can be located in one place for easier learning and for really deeply enabling the folks who are working on this problem day in and day out to take their focus to that strategic level of how do we not just spend the time aggregating the information, but now take it and help everyone figure out what to drive action on. So this is a quick look at the early stage estimation tool that we're actually releasing tomorrow. And that is, as I was mentioning, what's helpful at the very beginning stages of designing a building, getting an understanding of how to make choices around structural system, around the aggregation of floor area, and a number of different types of inputs. And then this is the portfolio dashboard of being able to see not just the impact of one project, but how it stacks up relative to other projects within your control and within any type of basically portfolio or campus that might be interesting to be able to highlight this project that has been driving embodied carbon down incredibly well, maybe has some learnings that we can apply to one that is tracking to be much higher relative to the baseline. So that is where I will leave you, because I am hoping that you walk away from this conversation with both the recognition of the ambitious scale of what needs to happen, and how we need to be driving that curve down, but also that it is possible for us to all figure out not just what the decisions that we need to make are, but to actually drive action around those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this presentation. And yes, you're right. I mean, it's very educational. I'm learning about this, but also I really like that you start with the good news, because sometimes when we work in our area, it's just like overwhelming of everything that we need to know and that needs to be moved. But yeah, it was nice to hear that things are happening, and also tools like yours can support this moving towards the right direction. I'm opening now for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or just straight go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question or comment or anything. Feel free to use the chat box as well. We have the next of the 20 minutes, around 20 minutes for just yeah. I would like to say, like, feel free, like we're in the room and then we can just chat. I know that it's challenging on online, but
Perfect.
anyway.
I'll add,
Here,
oh, if you don't mind,
go
Desi,
ahead.
I'll just add that this effort is only as good as the feedback and the participation of the many people who are working on embodied carbon. So very open to all feedback and questions, and would appreciate any thoughts.
Awesome. I'm starting with in the chat question. Is the Sustainable Materials Database publicly accessible? Are there some examples, case studies of low carbon embodied buildings?
So we're currently very much in the piloting phase of working with people and giving it on a pilot basis, but would be very happy to, if anyone is interested and wants to send their email, to work on getting that access so that we can get your feedback. And then the examples and case studies, we just are working on the first example, and we'll likely have that public, but it's very much dependent on the customers with whom we're working, if they're open to having their building information shared. So either way, Martin would love to chat and see if there is anything that we could share on that front.
And out of curiosity, I don't know if you can answer this, but with this building, is the client in the first case study, is it a municipality or it's a developer?
This one will be a developer.
Right.
Yeah.
Because when I was listening the presentation, I was wondering how equipped are developers in Ontario or like in Canada to measure the embodied carbon intensity of a building. And I don't know if you're aware of low carbon, because you mentioned that the most emissions are in the manufacturer. Are you aware of low carbon building materials manufacturers here in Canada?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's large regional variability, because obviously the grid in Calgary is very different from the grid in Toronto, and so that has big impacts on what the carbon footprint of materials manufactured in each location is. But we have a lot of materials that are both manufactured in Canada and also are available in the Canadian markets, and it ranges from everything from insulation that is going to have massive embodied carbon reductions possible just by selecting a different material. I think there are, at commercial scale, it's definitely a broader question that people are working on, but there are options, really neat ones at the residential scale, like recycled denim insulation or other cellulose-based options. And then there are also very viable options, I think, on the low carbon concrete side of the world. There's a lot of difficulty right now because people are realizing that the supplementary cementitious materials are very valuable, and there's a lot of demand, and so a lot of the manufacturers are working to figure out other ways to reduce the actual process emissions of producing their either concrete or cement. And there were a few marquee projects that some manufacturers have just announced in collaboration with the federal government. So there are different ways that people are trying to tackle it, either by importing the lower carbon materials or by investing in that infrastructure internally.
I love the idea of using recycled denim, because then you're tackling another problem with fast fashion, and like we have so much clothes, so why not just reuse it?
Yes.
I'm gonna jump to the next questions. How do you think Canada compares to the US embodied carbon being bought into construction decisions? You know that California is leading, but I just wondering the progress across US, Canada, and Europe.
Yeah, no, Gabby, this is a great question. And I think that this is my very unscientific analysis of it, but in general, we are seeing folks in Canada be a little bit ahead of the curve relative to folks in the States, and that there has been broader acceptance and understanding and education around embodied carbon as a concept. And a lot of the leaders in the space have come from Canada, and then that has trickled into the the ways that people are already, without even in the absence of regulation, are looking for these low carbon materials. So I would probably say the European markets are, of course, well ahead, and then definitely think that the broad variety, then comes Canada, and then comes the US, and California is probably, equivalent to what we've seen in the GTA or over in Vancouver.
Another good news that we are not that behind.
Yes.
Continuing with the questions, have there been third-party evaluation of low-carbon concrete? Just wondering, their real or perceived barriers to move forward to low-carbon concrete.
Yeah, so yes, there have been, which is really exciting. There are definitely right now many more projects around low carbon concrete in lab and test phase than there are actually in pilot or in use phase. But the ones that got started early, like the carbon built or the brimstones, these are now have already gone through the exact same testing requirements that traditional Portland cement has, and are being shown to be meeting those requirements to the same specifications. So the exciting piece there is that it now is shown that it's possible to be able to produce materials in a different way. The question is really going to be, how do we scale up both the demand for that and get the market comfortable with the profile of using something different than what they're used to, and then also how do we scale up the operations and production of those materials.
I really like your slide about the policies type, and we in Ontario, there is one of the also good news on our side is that a lot of municipalities are moving and having green development standards, and some of them are advancing. Not just you mentioned Toronto, but we have other examples now with incorporating embodied carbon within the green development standards. I was wondering, are you aware of other ways that this can happen? And I think a segue is also, I think it's open for also to the municipalities. Have any of the municipalities with green development standards thought about when they plan to embody carbon into the? Oh, okay, so some of the municipalities have already, and we're asking you on the call, the audience, if you are planning to embody it in your green development standards to incorporate embodied carbons. This is for the audience, and Nicole, for you, are you aware of other ways that municipalities can kind of push the industry towards that way?
Yeah, so I think municipalities have a really powerful role to play in this shift in how we change what gets built. And what we have been hearing just from questions from people in different municipalities is that everyone is trying to walk the tightrope of making sure that it's possible for developments to move forward, because obviously with the macro environment right now, we want to make sure that there are pathways to unlock pro formas for people so that they can continue to invest, and then at the same time that we are connecting that with the type of action that needs to happen on the embodied carbon front. So municipalities that we have been talking with, or we're hearing a lot of, why don't I just open up to question and comment and get this understanding from our local developers of what they're already doing, because that's been the starting point of what is going to be kind of the initial baselining and benchmarking action that people can take. And then once there's that understanding of, okay, how onerous is it going to be to request this of people, then it makes it easier to decide, should we start with first requiring benchmarking? Should we start to phase in some type of expectation of down the line, there are going to be embodied carbon intensity caps? And I think you've seen, obviously the the example that Vancouver set with their climate emergency action plan, and then also with the Vancouver building bylaw that just came into effect October 1 of this year. That was very much something that they had been telegraphing for a number of years, and I think that that's, in my mind, the best way to get the industry on board of putting out the feelers, getting the understanding of where people are, having those conversations, and then seeing what is going to be possible based on that.
Are there any training programs or workshops or like forums that this is happening, so that education among the developers, but also other industries, or like any certification in that area?
Yeah, so the Carbon Leadership Forum is an incredible resource. There are branches throughout Canada. The broader Ontario Carbon Leadership Forum will be, I think a fantastic resource for those in the GTA. And then I also think that the work, like the reports that I referenced from RMI, the formerly Rocky Mountain Institute, now just RMI, are great reference points. And that there's been some phenomenal work as well put out by folks across the pond over on the European side, with, for example, the LETI, LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative. Some of those reports have been very, very helpful for, initially years back as we were getting ramped up on what types of requirements to build in the tool, but in general for how municipalities can chart a path forward.
Great. Thanks everyone who is responding to our questions in the chat, and I'm happy to see that the conversation is continuing. But one question here is, what LCI database does the tool pull from?
Yeah, so we're using third-party verified environmental product declarations, or EPDs, and we are pulling those from EC3, which is a tool by Building Transparency, which has been incredible in leading the way in aggregating a lot of these EPDs. They are associated with the Carbon Leadership Forum, and so have a lot of crossover there. And then we also have third-party verified EPDs that, if we found them that weren't in that database, and then we will be licensing life cycle assessment information in the coming months as well, from a consulting group that worked with the World Green Building Council. It's WAP Sustainability, to create these LCA numbers for product categories that either don't have any coverage or don't have great coverage in product-specific EPDs or industry-wide EPDs. So that will also be coming. Think of like MEP equipment or cabinetry, these areas that have traditionally been really difficult to get a handle on.
Yeah, actually, this was one of my questions, and it's again for the audience as well, if you're aware as a municipal staff in this, but like, how does the municipality ensure the accuracy and reliability of life cycle analysis that are proven by builders?
Yeah, oh, sorry, it cut out just at the end for me.
Oh, yeah, and that's also for if anyone has experience of that, but like, how does the municipality ensures the accuracy and reliability of life cycle analysis data provided by the developer, the builder?
Yeah,
are there any like oh, sorry, you didn't hear me?
No, sorry, just if anyone has any thoughts on how they're doing it right now.
I'm curious. That's for the audience. I don't know if you know that, but that's
well, what I've seen is that there are a few different compliance pathways that municipalities have enacted. One is focusing on concrete, and saying we want to make sure that all of the concrete that is specified or used is going to be at or below a certain % reduction or a certain embodied carbon intensity. That's what we saw actually starting a number of years ago in Marin County in California. And then there have been a number of places that have adopted similar types of, okay, we're taking these specific EPDs, environmental product declarations, because they are third-party verified to an international standard. That's a helpful way to benchmark. So you can go that product specific route. And that is also in general, as with the legislation that, or the building code that California has coming online, that's one of the reduction pathways of saying, okay, you need to make sure that all of the materials you're specifying are below a certain threshold relative to these standard EPDs. The other route that we're seeing is embodied carbon intensities. And then there's a lot of nuance to your point of how do you verify that. And a lot of the times it's just use an approved tool or use this scope and make sure that you're covering like these modules. But it's a tricky problem that requires a lot of research.
Thanks, Nico. I will kind of like be quiet just for a couple of seconds to see if someone wants to tune in and comment or ask a question. I don't see anyone, but in the like last. Oh, actually, we're. I didn't realize we are at the end of the of our webinar. But I guess I had like one last clarification. You show on the presentation the kind of like the resource about low carbon materials and procurement. Is that publicly available, or it's only if they is that part of the website, the tangible website, or it's kind of like a service that you provide additional?
Yeah, so right now it is, we have everything just kind of in our demo environment, but it's something that if there are any folks who would be interested in, we'd be very interested in having the conversation, because we want to have it be used to drive action forward and have that be the primary impact. So it's more a function of the stage that we're at right now of wanting to make sure that we can improve it with directed feedback.
Great. Thank you so much. And
Absolutely.
I think with this, we will end our webinar. Okay. Thank you so much, Nicole, for being with us for this 1 hour and providing the great information. Thanks everyone for being with us today. And stay tuned for more of our webinars and upcoming events. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.